Well, greetings, everybody. I think I'll take our seats and get started this evening. I'm Jim Walker. I'm a member of the Leadership Council of the George Schnitzer Museum of Art, and I'd really like to welcome all of you here tonight for this gallery talk. Really pleased to see really a larger number of people here tonight, and I think you're going to be well entertained. These gallery talks, as maybe some of you know, are periodic events, but they really give us the opportunity to kind of link the two important functions or mission functions of the museum, that is the academic and faculty and scholarly information that we bring towards these exhibitions, as well as the exhibition themselves, which of course is designed for public consumption, public enjoyment. And tonight we are going to be, we're thrilled actually to have one of our special curatorial staff, somebody whom I'm quite fond, Danielle Knapp, talk to us about the exhibition that's upstairs. I know Danielle as the David McCosh Fellow at the Schnitzer Museum of Art. I also know her for working with her personally to help curate an exhibition that is coming up in the next few months or so. But Danielle is also very knowledgeable and expert about many Pacific Northwest artists, including Carl Morris, and gave a talk, I understand, at the library last month, or in October, about some of the biographical features of Carl Morris, and tonight is going to talk about this wonderful series of Morris's religious paintings that were featured at the Oregon Centennial and have been shown here before. So without further ado, I'd like you to please welcome Danielle Knapp, and we will look forward to her presentation.
Thank you, Jim, for such a nice introduction. Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming. The image on the screen is, if you have not yet been up in the galleries to see the current exhibition of these murals, this is a photograph from when they were on view in 2007, at the time of a longer exhibition that Lawrence Fong had curated at the time. So you might be asking, why on view again now, a couple of years later? Certainly that's a great question, and we were excited to have a chance to put them on view again because of two reasons, really. Three reasons, I should say. The first being they were so well received. People enjoyed seeing them so much in 2007, and we're asked about them frequently, and due to their size, it's hard to find a time to exhibit them with the available space. So we had a window in which we could put them on view over the holidays that seemed just perfect. Secondly, because in 2008 we received a gift of several of the preparatory drawings that Carl Morris had made for these murals, given to us from his son, so it was a time for us to revisit the material now that we had more documents and more sketches from which to study them. And then third, because we were the recipient of an IMLS grant a few years ago for their conservation. Although they were in good enough condition to be shown, they looked great when they were up in 2007, 2 years ago, a special conservator treated all of the canvases, taking care of areas of paint loss and abrasions, and so they've really been spiffed up to a point where we were excited to have this opportunity to show them to you again, or if it's the first time you've seen them, to introduce them to you. So the talk that I've put together, which I decided to hold in this space instead of in the gallery because I wanted to be able to show you some of the images of those sketches and some photographs from the time of their initial exhibition at the Centennial. 1959. I will get to the murals, I promise, but first I'm going to go through some of the history of the fair that was held in 1959 so that we can kind of establish an understanding of the circumstances for which they were made, and then also talk about some of the early biography of Carl Morris so that we can talk about the point that he was at when he was commissioned to create these. And then what I think we'll do at the conclusion of this presentation is I'll invite you to go upstairs with me and we can continue to have a conversation and address any questions you might have. In 1959, on the occasion of the state's 100th birthday, they decided to hold a centennial celebration, which was held just north of Portland. The images on the screen here are scans from one of the brochures that was distributed at the time of the celebration. And Oregon's 100th birthday, as often was done for these fairs that were held, this was actually the largest since the 1939 one held, I think, in San Francisco. And then the Seattle's fair was held a few years later, at which time they put in the Space Needle, they established their monorail system. So to give you a context for how big of a of a celebration this was for the state. It took up a lot of the state's resources. A lot of people attended. 24 countries were involved and set up booths and provided activities and lectures related to their cultural history. So it really was a gathering of a lot of different cultures celebrating Oregon's history and celebrating Oregon's future. For that reason, the Centennial had a byline of Frontier of the Future, so kind of hearkening back to the state's pioneering past, but also looking at what sort of positive direction will we take in the future with the state. It was held on 80 acres of land, and at the time there was one building on the land that was sort of a landscape, or excuse me, a livestock building, and so 2 architects were hired to retrofit that building as well as expand the fairgrounds to create a suitable place to hold this amazing event. The exposition was advertised as promising to cover all phases of state activity with special attention paid to basic exhibits of lumber, of agriculture, aquatics, electronics, power, fashion, food processing, light metals, fishing, and sports. So trying to really represent all of the industries that were taking place in Oregon. These are some images from the Oregon Historical Society of the fair site. In the foreground of this photograph, you can see the main building, which was known simply as the Centennial building, which covered about 11 acres in itself. From that building expanded areas devoted to different attractions, different exhibition spaces. One of the things they had hoped to do for the exposition was to create a monument that would kind of identify that and really put Portland on the map in terms of exciting monuments like the Eiffel Tower or the Space Needle or the atomium structure in Brussels. There were plans to do a decahedron building, a very large one with large fins that would reach way up into the sky, sort of giving the impression of looking forward, looking up. Those plans were scrapped pretty early on when they realized that it was a little too ambitious for what they were going to be able to do. So nothing really remains of these fairgrounds. There's the Paul Bunyan sculpture that you might be familiar with driving through Portland that's in, I think, the Kenton area, that was erected as part of the festivities. So that still stands. But beyond that, and beyond the murals existing, although they're now here at the museum, not much remains of the actual fairgrounds. So it's really beneficial to have these photographs and the remembrances of people who were involved for us to sort of reconstruct what it might have been like to be there in 1959. A view of the main building again. At this time in the 50s, the architecture that was happening in Portland and throughout America was really taking a new direction, had really branched off from the sort of Beaux-Arts columns that you might have seen at the end of the 19th century, even separate from sort of this international style that would have been very rectangular and maybe using a lot of glass and steel. Architects were really becoming interested in showing this sort of regional emphasis. So that meant using local woods, using cheaper materials so that they could create more modest buildings sometimes, but also so that they could create buildings that could accommodate more because they weren't spending all of their funds on granite or marble or something like that. So you see the beginning of a lot of use of aluminum and wood paneling and some different materials that the architects were using for very specific reasons, because a lot of them were identifying with this sort of interest in regional architecture, and you saw that happening within the fine arts too. On the heels of the Works Progress Administration and sort of what the government and the culture was trying to do was to promote this very American style of art, to promote artwork and buildings that celebrated American industry. You had a lot of architects who were looking at that and looking at ways of how can I work with these artists. You think of a building like Timberline Lodge that was built with government funds that employed both specialty architects and fine artists to do a project together. And so this was all in the minds of the people who were working on this project at the time. These are some of the renderings before the fair was made. That sculpture on the top, which was actually a lit, gasoline-powered lit, I don't want to say fountain, that seems very scary, a fountain of fire. That was actually built, and I've neglected to include a photograph of the actual sculpture, but that was one of the highlights that drew people to the fair, was to see this really amazing sculpture on fire. and this is one of the murals that was painted on the outside of one of the buildings at the fairgrounds. When it came time to choose the architects who were planning the fair, who, as I had mentioned, were going to be retrofitting the main building for the fair, but also in charge of creating the exhibition spaces and the landscape of the 80 acres, they chose two architects, one of which had a very strong regional bias, Kenneth Richardson, who was also working as a partner with an architect named Donald Stewart, who was a well-known modernist architect. So this was really sort of an endorsement of the ideas that they had when the state was hiring them to take on this project. A committee was overseeing all the aspects of the expo, and so they were given a great deal of control in what the plans would look like, but of course they had to answer to a committee of people who had the best interests of the community and represented a lot of different aspects of the community in mind. At the expo site, I'll go back just really quick. At the expo site, Stewart and Richardson built an Adventureland, a forestry pavilion, and an International Land of Tomorrow, which included an enormous flower clock on the ground with plants representing all the different countries that were involved in the expo. And it was in this Adventureland that they built a Hall of Religions, and they built a Japanese tea garden. And initial plans had been for a chapel to be built on the site, but because they were using state funds, they were prevented from actually doing a place of religious worship. So what they had decided to do was to create a building that could instead celebrate, instead of providing a place to perform religious worship, create a building that celebrated 100 years of religious worship that had happened in the state. A committee was formed representing many of the major religions active in the state, but they also had specialists who counted 179 religions that they could identify as having active members in Oregon. And so the task began to make a small building that could somehow incorporate the history of these belief systems while not misrepresenting anyone, while not stepping on any toes, while not pushing any agenda. So it was a monumental task just in itself, and that was just one building of the whole expo that many people were involved in these conversations. Because I mentioned that Richardson and Stewart were very interested in sort of the contemporary architecture, contemporary art of the time, it's important to realize that although they might have been more progressive in their interest in art, as were a lot of people involved in the fair, as were a lot of people in Portland, both architects and artists and clients, there were plenty of people who weren't quite as progressive, who were more interested in maintaining representational art, who were interested in sort of continuing a landscape tradition only, or a WPA figurative tradition only. By the 40s and 50s, a lot was happening where abstraction was becoming a very strong force in American contemporary art. And so these architects were interested in having abstract artists represented for decorating the fairgrounds. So we'll go back in time a little bit to introduce Carl Morris into how he fits into this story, because in the 1930s, when these photographs were taken, Carl Morris, who had initially intended to be a ceramics artist and then had a life-changing experience as a young man when he happened upon José Orozco working on his mural at Pomona College of Prometheus, at which that moment, even though he hadn't exchanged hardly any words with the Spanish-speaking muralist, seeing that work in progress and being so moved by the power of painting, decided on the spot, I am serious about painting now. This is going to be my direction. So Morris, as a college-age young artist, enrolled in the Chicago School of Art, and he also traveled abroad studying on fellowships in Vienna and Paris, and really devoted himself wholly to painting. And he's always identified that one defining moment as the reason why he had switched gears when he was only 18 years old, I think. These are two photographs from the 30s of Carl Morris. After he returned from Europe, he found work for a while in Hollywood. He was really disheartened by the experience he had working on set design in Hollywood. As the son of farmers, someone who loved the land, even early in his life, he really was showing an interest in this natural landscape, the natural surroundings. He hated that he was on a crew of people who would go and have to wipe out vineyards to put up a set for a Shirley Temple movie. And he just felt like he was involved in this destruction that didn't speak to him as an artist. And he would later say he knew that Hollywood was no place for an artist. So he got out of that business and was working in a print shop when the government approached him to lead to open up an art center. And they really gave him free reign of where he wanted to go in the country. They said, where would you like to go? We'd like you to be one of the founders of one of our first federal arts centers under the WPA program. He had never been to Spokane, Washington. He didn't know anyone in Spokane, Washington at the time, but he said to them, I'm interested in the outdoors. I'd like to go somewhere where I can be on the water. I'm from Spokane. We do have a waterfall. It's certainly not on the water if you're thinking of a coastal area, and he said later in interviews that the person who got him to sign up for Spokane was a great salesman, because they said, they have a waterfall you won't believe. We're going to send you to Spokane. You're going to love it. You'll be so inspired. And so he went. And so he started the Spokane Arts Center, which ended up being one of the most successful art centers that was founded in the 30s. So many people were served by the free classes they offered. They brought specialty artists in all different media from around the country, including his future wife, sculptor Hilda Grossman, to teach there. And so it was really an active center of learning. It was a place where the community really had a lot of engagement and could really contribute to shaping arts in their local city. And so a lot of good was happening there, but for Carl Morris, in his really prestigious role as their director, he found very little time to paint. He found very little time to devote himself to what he wanted to do. And so his involvement with these kinds of government-sponsored jobs was short-lived, because after a few years he had had enough of being in a situation where he didn't have the freedom to indulge in his true passion, which was painting. This is an example of the type of art he was creating. This was a WPA commission that was on view last year for a student-curated exhibition on WPA art. So this is held here at the Jordan Schnitzer Museum. All of the works that were created under the WPA are actually not in permanent collections of the institutions where they reside. They're still owned by the government on a sort of long-term loan to the appropriate places to care for them and store them. So Carl Morris was working in Seattle for some time, trying to make a living as an artist. He wasn't teaching often, but he'd had a houseboat where he would host parties, and he was involved with conversations with Mark Tobey and Morris Graves and all the movers and shakers of Seattle's art scene in the 40s and 50s. But his wife, he had married Hilda by now. They actually were married the day after they both quit their jobs for the government. She, being a native New Yorker and also knowing how important the New York scene was in sort of drawing attention away from Paris as the international scene of contemporary art, she was really excited about what was going on in New York, and she wanted Carl to be there. She wanted both of them to be there. And so it was always sort of a tension, I think, in her trying to pull him out of this Northwest that he had fallen in love with and make him go to New York, where maybe he could have become an even bigger sensation on a national or international scale than he was. But he always really resisted that. He felt that being in the Northwest provided him something that being in a busy city like New York, whereas he said someone would come by every night with a bottle of wine and want to come in his studio and interrupt his work and talk to him, he just was really dissatisfied by that. So he had spent years resisting going back or going to New York, and at the time when he and Hilda he was getting worn down, he was going to go and make a go for it in New York. They had actually gone over there and set up a studio. He received a commission for the 2 post office murals here in Eugene, which still exist, and they're in a public space. So if you've never seen them in person, you can park on the street and walk in and see them within a minute. Lumbering and agriculture were the titles that his topics. And he actually had to compete, as many of the post office murals were decided by a juried competition. This was kind of a unique case, an unfortunate case, in which the 2 people who were the finalists, their names were known at the end, so it wasn't completely anonymous at the end, and it caused a lot of tension when he was selected over the other artist who had suggested themes of canning green beans. So if that artist who he almost won, they reversed a decision at the end, so otherwise you would have gone in and seen green beans and strictly agricultural and canning subjects. So receiving that mural commission was much needed funds for Morris. He had actually been working in a shipyard during the wartime to make ends meet, and he had been able to create art. He had been selling some of his art, showing some of his art, but really the prestige that comes with getting a commission like that is what kind of elevated his name and gave him that feeling that maybe I really should stick with it. So he moved permanently to Portland, which is where he remained kept as his home base the rest of his life. Throughout the 40s, his work became, of course, for a mural like this, there's a certain expectation on the style that the artist is using. It confines to a certain expectation of the community and these sort of WPA themes and motifs. In his own artwork, he became much more abstracted. He became much more interested in providing sort of a sensation and creating an inner light to his works. You've sometimes I've seen his figures described as being carved out of the canvas, and you can see the sort of angular, almost like tectonic plates forms in some of these paintings that he did over the following years. And he got to the point where he was really interested in exploring these deconstructed forms entirely. He was, as many of the artists, especially in the Northwest, were doing, he would take a lot from his experiences of viewing the natural landscape and traveling. And so, although he very rarely gave his works titles of specific places by name, often they were, the idea had started because of somewhere he had traveled. In later series of his works, you'll see him title them after places he had visited on fishing trips. This is a portrait of the artist Louis Bunce sitting in front of a mural that he had done for the Portland airport in 1958. And Louis and Carl Morris were friends. They were in the same circle in Portland. I show this to you because this is the type of artwork that in the late 50s, this is what the architects of the expo were looking to have at their fair. This is what they thought was exciting. This was a topic of conversation. But this is also what was making a lot of people very mad. This mural in the airport was initially rejected based on the first sketches that Bunce had turned in, because when he submitted them to the committee, the chairman of the committee looked at it and said, "What is that?" and just was not interested at all. There was sort of a public outcry because a lot of people were in support of this type of art. And so they did agree to let him go ahead with the mural, which Bunce says, yes, it is abstract, but he didn't want to paint just an airplane, the wing of a plane. What he wanted to do is create something about the energy, talk about uplift, about air, about what you might be, the sensation you might have when you're experiencing travel through an airport. And so when this was installed, he actually had garbage dumped in his front yard. So there was a lot of animosity towards some of the artists in Portland who were doing this type of artwork. It's kind of hard to believe now because we've been seeing this for many decades, and these artists went on to be some of Oregon's greatest names in modern art. So Bunce was one of the 3 artists who was also hired to complete murals for the fair. And this is the building that was built to house the murals that are upstairs. It was a 10-sided building. Because the architects couldn't get the major decahedron building they wanted, they compromised by reserving that shape for the Hall of Religious History, sometimes called the Hall or the House of Religions too. I've seen them used, so sometimes I call them different things. But here in the Garden of Tomorrow, visitors would approach and enter into the first side of the building. On all of the 9 sides surrounding them would have been the places for the murals and places for exhibitions of religious artifacts. So the committee who was in charge of overseeing the murals completion was also in charge of selecting from all of the work that the various religious committees had presented to them to consider for in these display cases. So certainly not an easy task. These are some of the preliminary sketches that are now in our collection that Morris had created for submitting to the committee who was working on making the final decisions to approve his murals. We have 20 in the collection, and you can see how in some of these earlier iterations he is exploring things that might be identified as religious iconography or something that you might be able to assign a particular religious belief to. But he really wanted to move away from that, and he really spent a lot of time, as the architects did, in trying to create a building that would have these universal themes to really serve their whole community's audience. He thought about what is a unifying feature amongst all of these religious beliefs, and the thing he kept going back to was the presence of light. However man and light intersect, he thought that was something that every one of these religious traditions had approached or was important to them, so he really wanted to focus on incorporating that somehow in his murals. It's often been said that it took 8 to 10 weeks. He was given 8 to 10 weeks to complete the very large 8x10 panels upstairs. That was the result of so much deliberation amongst the committee that by the time they approved his designs, that's all the time he had left. So he had started on this process much earlier and had been thinking on these ideas for some time, and by the time everybody had signed off on it, he had very little time left. And the experience really frustrated him, and he said later he would never do another commission by committee, and I believe that he never did again. This is an image from a newspaper article in 1959 before the fair opened, showing Carl and Hilda, who was helping him with some of the underpainting of these monumental canvases in his very small studio. He was working on several at the same time, and so they were leaned up against one another, and he was in very close proximity, and a really intimate experience of spending so much time so close to the work you're creating. And I included the images on the bottom so you can kind of match up with the photograph. The article that in which this was printed, the writer actually had a very favorable view of what was happening with the Hall of Religious History, and he wrote of his visit to the studio. He said, "It's like being in a place of worship without any walls." He was so moved by seeing Morris at work on his murals and being surrounded by them. And so a lot of people were really excited. It was a big draw for people to come and see. A few people definitely weren't as excited. We have one letter in our records, and I'll read you an excerpt from it if I find where I put it in my notes, from someone who is particularly unhappy with the murals. Let's see here. I don't know where I put it. The gist of it was that he said, "I am so disheartened to hear that these murals are going up and that this has become a forum for semi-abstract art. I'm not against it per se, but I'm so concerned that when I get there, I won't be able to recognize the great missionaries of Oregon history, and people are going to come and they're going to be so upset, and this should be a venue for teaching our children a very simple, straightforward story, and instead the committee has decided to use it as a way to promote their ideas on contemporary art." And this gentleman who was had been involved with one of the committees was writing this to the chair of the committee. So you can imagine that by the time it opened, people were flocking to see to decide for themselves what they thought of this. Richardson, the architect, himself had said he wanted no picture postcard art in this section of the expo. He said, "Enough of that will be happening in Frontierland. We'll have representations of trains. We'll have representations of industry. We don't need to have a representation of that in every aspect of the expo." So they really stuck to their guns in fighting against people who would have liked to have seen otherwise. One of the members of the committee who was working on overseeing these murals and making selections was a gentleman out of Portland named Father John Domin, who was a Catholic priest. And at the time of the exhibition, he wrote an explanation from his standpoint, so this is with a Catholic background, of what each of these murals represents. And they're universal enough that I think in reading his description, you do get a sense of how this might apply, hopefully, to other religious faiths. So if you bear with me, I'll read each of these as I go through these for you. The first is light breaking across darkness. The brilliant burst of light symbolizes the message of faith, the good news, as brought to Oregon by the pioneers. Groups over the land contains areas of color, each overlaid with outlines of figures. Each area of color represents groups of pioneers differing in the faiths with which they brought to the new state. Emerging units of light traverse the dark. Contains brilliant areas of color, each reflecting the different kinds of faith represented by the groups who have arrived. The intersection of light, people, and structures features a large area of outline designs as the people form a horizontal pattern across the painting but come in contact with the vertical white light of God's presence. Books and tablets contains the large book symbolizing written words revealed to us by our God. Convening voices depicts figures emerging into and sharing the light. Units of light form the structure, is covered with line patterns based upon designs of the types of religious architecture reflecting the various faiths now within the state. Horizons gives a view of architectural patterns of temples, synagogues, and churches in different designs of the past century. Although Morris said he wasn't trying to put anything specific into these, he did admit later he was influenced thinking about Ravenna and architecture he had seen in his travels as a student. So looking at some of these forms, sometimes you can imagine where he might have been and where he's drawing these memories from to create his art. And then the last is shafts of light in the circle. It's a burst of white light containing within itself the blank outlines of figures. The previous murals presented the past and present religious history, but this last one signifies our future. That's saw the whole series together. At the conclusion of the 100 days of the expo, it was held over the summer for a period of 100 days to continue the celebration, the Centennial theme. This museum, at the time, the University of Oregon Museum of Art had requested the murals, and so they were gifted to us by the Centennial Commission at the close of the fair and have been here since. Morris had wanted them to only ever be shown together. He had intended them to be one unit, to provide one experience for the viewer. At one time, 2 or maybe 4 series were shown in another building on campus, which he was okay with. That was run past him. He was comfortable with that. But really, he had intended them for you to be surrounded by them. And so in the show upstairs, we've tried to create as close to that sensation as we can by closing in the gallery space tighter than it was in the 2007 show, so that you have an opportunity to see not where they might start, because they shouldn't start in one place, but how they all connect to one another. At the conclusion of the expo, a report from Donald Green, who was the assistant manager of the Hall of Religion, was submitted to the higher-ups working on the fair. And he addressed some of the early skepticism towards the murals and towards the possibility of a Hall of Religious History of making its community happy. He kind of gave his report on how everything had gone, and he said that the public's enjoyment of the space was evident by the way people approached the space, how they conducted themselves in the space, what they wrote in the guest book. And he said that they played religious and symphonic music. They piped that in during the time too. So when you were in the space, you were looking at these exhibits. You had murals up above your eye level. I have a picture of that next to show you. This is their original installation. So you can see how high they were above visitors to the fair. And they would have been directly lit above, kind of leaning in towards you. So he said, people overwhelmingly, it was very positive about what was happening there. And it's interesting what he says about the murals themselves. I want to get his exact words again. So this is from the letter that he wrote at the same time. He said, observing people who visited the expo and came to the Hall of Religious History, they fell into 3 categories in regards to their reaction to the art. The first group, the vast majority, observed the murals and accepted them as art or as an abstract nature and did not formulate any particular opinion, either good or bad. The second group approached the murals with a closed mind. No matter how much was explained to them, they did not want to learn. This group was the smallest minority of the 3, and we found a peculiar quality in the character of the persons within this group. This quality, in almost every case, was that the people seemed to be ignorant of all art in general. The third and final group contained the people who were completely engrossed in the art. These people continuously made their own reproductions and sat on the benches for long periods of time admiring the work of Mr. Morris. Following the expo, Carl Morris was able to continue down this road that he had gone in really responding to the atmosphere and landscape of the Northwest, and I included some of his later works to show you how he continued to take this idea of monumental scale, monumental forms, fields of color, and this luminosity he was able to give his artwork as he did these later works and some later large series. In the 70s, he actually discovered acrylics for the first time. He had been using oil paints for this entire first half of his career. And with oil paints working so closely, you saw the large canvases in a small studio space, how closely and how long of a time he would spend with them. He would get headaches from the fumes, and the whole first decades, he thought that was just part of suffering for your art, that if you were a serious painter, you just dealt with the headaches, and it was when he switched to acrylics he realized that, this doesn't have to be painful, it doesn't have to make me sick. Acrylics, too, because of the nature of the medium, allow for much brighter colors, much more light imbued in the paint, and so he was really able to reach a whole new level of adding light to his imagery. He continued to paint almost up until his death in 1993, and in an interview that he did in 1993, when he was asked about abstraction and he was asked about his experience of staying in the Northwest and what it provided to him as a painter, both for his lifestyle and for his sort of artistic fulfillment, he talked about how music is something that we might take for granted, that you're expected to listen to music and you have a reaction. You don't always have to explain the reaction. It's okay just to respond. And he thought abstract art should really be approached the same way, that if you have to explain it, you're losing the mystery, and the mystery is the point. And I think he meant that even not just to abstraction, but in art in general, in the visual arts. He really was trying to communicate, as the best visual artists usually are, something that could not be said in words, could not adequately be expressed in any other means. And so he really wanted people to experience the artwork rather than seek out an explanation. I've included some of the links and sources that I used for information for this presentation. I realize the text now is very small probably to see there, but I'm happy to share any of the sources if anyone wants to do additional reading onto any of the subjects related to the fair or Carl Morris, or particularly these murals. What I thought we might want to do is head upstairs to look at the murals more closely together. That concludes my presentation portion, so if there are questions for me here, we could talk about them now, but I'm happy to also talk in the gallery space too for some time, which is usually more fun in front of the art. So thank you so much for listening, and I appreciate you coming in tonight, and I look forward to hearing what you think of the murals. Yes, Tim?
All religions, there were other canvases or other paintings up on the wall. Were those by Morris, or not? Were they more representation?
The small,
Yeah.
those, I think those are the display cases. So they would have been individually lit, and in the display cases would have been anything documenting the religious history of various communities. So there might have been a pioneer's Bible, there might have been paperwork related to the establishment of the first temple, things like that. I couldn't find an inventory of all of the historical objects that were included, but I know those were the only artworks included there. And the architects had actually said that they thought hiring muralists to complete work for the expo made the most sense financially. They paid $10,000 for this commission, and it was the most high profile because they said they wanted art by the pound, by the inch. And so they thought they were getting a good deal for art by the pound. and they felt strongly about the art too. I have always approached these murals thinking of what a genius Carl Morris was in finding this balance between all of the religious histories that he was tasked with presenting. I'm realizing now, I've done research, that while that's true, this was an idea that everyone else involved with the Hall of Religious Histories was also concerned with. The architects certainly were interested in not wanting to promote Christianity or Judaism or something over one another. So they were all working towards a common goal in the end.
Daniel, did Morris, you mentioned how short a time he had to work. Was he fully aware during the time he was working of the facility and its shape?
Yes. Yes, he had several meetings with the committee, and I think that the building was finished at the time when he was even starting the murals, and so he was told in advance of accepting the commission exactly what the scale would be and what would be expected of him. So he knew what he had to work with. There's a wonderful interview that he did for the oral histories, and the transcript's available online, in which he talks very candidly about this experience. That's where I found the quote about never wanting to work for a commission again, just because of the pressure. It wasn't that it was an entirely negative experience, just the pressure on him to create the artwork was very difficult, but he was happy with his final results. He was very happy with them. Hey, John?
These are very near and dear to my heart. I've seen them now 3 times altogether. And the first time was in 1959. I was all of 9 years old and went to the first day of the fair. It was a very memorable experience. I tried to find a photograph and told very wrong about that my father had known Mark Hatfield, who was then the governor when they were at Glen Lukens. So there was a photograph taken on me between my father and Mark Hatfield. But for me, being photographed with Mark Hatfield as a 9-year-old boy meant very little. But when I went to this pavilion, which was very distinctly looking to a 9-year-old boy, it looked like something that I could build at home or something. But when I went in, I was much shorter than most of the people that you see. So the only way that I could take in these massive murals, and to a 9-year-old boy, of course, they look even more massive than they do today, was to stand in the center and rotate myself around and crane my head up this way. And it was a very overpowering experience. I had never seen art on that scale before then. And relatively few times since then. And by way of comparison, 3 years later, we went to Seattle with the Seattle World's Fair. I saw the Space Needle. It didn't make nearly the impression that this all of religious history and particularly the interior murals made. So it was, I think, a very formative experience for me in art appreciation.
Can you tell us what's in those cases? Since you were there.
Well, they were more traditional implements and artifacts of what I would call traditional religious history. And I, as I say, didn't pay much attention to them because I was just overpowered by the scale and the colors in these huge murals. So that the stuff in the cases, which was the more traditional stuff, which was there, I think, to satisfy the people who didn't like the murals. I was in group 3.
You were in group 3, yeah. Exactly, good. Yes?
Yeah, do you know where Morris's studio was in Portland when he was creating? Or where it would have been?
Yes. Yes. I do know, and because I can't think of it off the top of my head, it's in my notes somewhere here. He actually, I want to say it was like Skyline. Does that make sense for Portland? That's yeah. He refers to it. I think it's his Skyline studio. If that's wrong, I'll find it, but I believe that's correct. And when he moved to a larger studio later, when he had more space to spread out, he returned to this idea of doing series of murals just for his own enjoyment, not as a commission. So his later studio allowed him to spread out the canvases and create his Silver Creek series and other series from various travels around the state. Yes?
Danielle, do you know about his spiritual or religious background? What tradition did he come
All I know about that is, much is made of a spiritual element in his paintings, not just these, but I think anytime, at least for me as an art historian and as just a human being, when I'm confronted with paintings that are kind of all-encompassing and they engross you in the material and they are so successful, I think sometimes it feels like a little bit of a religious experience. And so because he provides that so successfully in his large works and his small works that are so beautifully composed, much has been made of that spiritual element of reaching attaining a sort of a higher level of art making. But he never really identified strongly in one tradition. In the interview with him, he really skirts that question, and that wasn't in his goals. He wasn't regularly attending a church or other worship service. And so I think his interest here was in the human element. That's really me guessing from what I know of him through research. I think he was interested in this human experience that religion provided, and he wanted to explore that personal experience with religion, but I don't think that he was secretly trying to promote an agenda or thinking, about that. Not that you suggested that, but
humanism that's manifested, and where did he get that?
And the people who were on the committee provided him with a lot of information for thinking about before he did his initial sketches. So he was presented with a history of all of these different groups and went through quite a serious process of study, of familiarizing himself with the groups that he would need to represent or at least address. And so he was very knowledgeable in Oregon's religions at the point when he was doing this.
Do you find in the periods we're talking about here any of the interest, which I understand anyway is common interest, that you showed in geologic forms and the colors of minerals and so forth? Do you sense that there's any interest at this stage in his life of that?
I absolutely do. Even if we look at the earlier works he was doing in the 40s, the figurative works, one of his really gorgeous paintings, the Out of the Coulee, he was as interested in sort of this natural formation as the figures that he placed in it. So I think looking at images like this, there's such a sense of an understanding of topography or an understanding of how shapes are created, and I think that was always tied in with the natural landscape for him. And he was always thinking on the bigger scale. So later in his very accomplished, more abstract, large works in the 70s and 80s, the acrylics, sometimes you look at them and you don't know if this is something of cosmic subject matter, you don't know if it's geological, you don't know if it's something you might see through a microscope. The fact that you can't tell I think is a really beautiful moment that's somewhat recognizable, but you can't reach a place where you're giving a name to it.
Kind of or transitional sculptural quality of relief and relief sculpture. Kind of the sense of wanting to hold something in your hands.
And working, being married to Hilda, they had a really interesting relationship, because a lot of the times when you're looking at these artist pairings, a very accomplished female artist who married a very accomplished male artist, sometimes because of the nature of the community they were in, or expectations on female gender roles, sometimes they kind of had to take a back seat in the art making. It certainly was not the case for these two, and I think in part, maybe it was because he was a painter, she was a sculptor, so he was living with and working alongside a sculptor, certainly thinking about sculptural ideas, but not doing it himself. And they only showed their work together once at an exhibition that I think was held here at the U of O, and they said never again. They did not do it again. Yes?
I understood that it was essentially the pair of them, Carl and Hilda, which generated these murals we're going to see. And I just wanted to know if you had discovered there's another figure there.
So that's
how many people actually worked on it?
I only know of the two of them working on it. And what I've heard is that Hilda was doing a lot of the preparatory work for the canvases, helping stretch the canvases and prepare them. There would have been many layers of paint applied before this sort of the design was sketched in. So she was involved in that, but she never was associated with taking credit for the artwork. So she was assisting him, but it was really his project. And looking at the sketches that he did, the image doesn't do it justice to look at these flat images, but for many of these, what he had been doing was building up these images and scraping things away. And on some of them he applied like tissue paper and was experimenting with how would this look through a sort of filter, how do I paint that sort of filter. And so it's very interesting to see his thought process documented in that way, for him to get to a point where he was pleased with the way that the white was added to this image, or the way that he layered these shapes. And it was a long process of exploring that through materials that I think he personally was doing on these 6 by 4 inch little pieces of board. The fact that they maintained their powerful imagery when he stretched them, expanded them to the canvas size they are, is really telling too, that he could think on that scale when working on such a small scale during his preparations. So I think it might be a good time if anyone wants to join me upstairs or has any other questions or wants to take another look at the work after hearing about this. I'd love to hear your thoughts on them. So thank you again so much.